The Nag Hammadi library came out of the ground inside a sealed clay jar at Jabal al-Tarif, and the man who broke that jar open with a mattock was hoping for gold. What he found instead was 13 books, not scrolls, actual books, with leather covers and stitched pages, sewn shut and tied. Inside them, a complete Gospel of Thomas, the only complete copy there is, a page with 2 gaps in the papyrus, one of them sitting exactly where the sentence about Jesus and Mary Magdalene should be, and a novel you have definitely heard of grew out of that gap. One book copied out 3 separate times, and that tells you which text these people could not risk losing. A poem spoken by a woman who calls herself the whore and the Holy One in the same breath. And one item that is not a gospel, is not Gnostic, and is not even translated properly. I'll come back to that one, because it's the strangest thing in the jar. Here's where this is going. The famous texts, the strange ones, and the one nobody can explain. How all of it traveled from the foot of a cliff in Upper Egypt to a glass case in Cairo. And why, more than 80 years later, the people who study these books still can't agree on who put them there. None of this asks you to take a side on whether the Gnostics were right about anything. These are objects, and objects have a history. This one starts with 2 brothers and a pair of camels. The Nag Hammadi Library. What was actually in the jar at Jabal al-Tarif? December 1945. Upper Egypt, on the east bank of the Nile, a few weeks before Coptic Christmas. Jabal al-Tarif is a limestone cliff, standing about 11 kilometres northeast of the town of Nag Hammadi. It's honeycombed. There are caves in the face of it, and tombs cut into the rock 4,000 years ago. At the bottom there's a long slope of soft debris that has been sliding off the cliff since the pharaohs. That slope is the only reason anybody goes there. Soil at the bottom of a cliff like this collects nitrates, so Egyptian farmers dig it out and spread it on their fields. The word for it is sabak. It's fertilizer, it's free, and it is the least romantic reason imaginable to be standing in that desert with a mattock. Muhammad Ali al-Samman rode out there that month with his brother Khalifa. They hobbled the camels beside a large boulder and started digging around its base. That is the story as Muhammad Ali told it, 30 years afterwards. Hold on to that, because the final act of this episode is about how much weight that story can take. The mattock hit something that wasn't stone and wasn't earth. It was a jar, red slipware, 4 small handles at the shoulder, roughly 60 centimeters tall, with a lid sealed onto the mouth. Somebody had put it there on purpose and closed it properly. Muhammad Ali didn't open it straight away. He told the scholar James Robinson, decades later, that he stood there working out whether it was worth the risk. A sealed vessel in the desert might have a jinn shut inside it, and you don't let a jinn out for nothing. Then he thought about gold. Gold won. He swung. What emerged wasn't gold. It was papyrus, in fragments, catching the light on the way up. Underneath the fragments were the books, 13 of them, as they were counted at the time, bound in leather, still stacked the way somebody had left them centuries ago. Nobody in the family could read a line of it. The language inside was Coptic, which is Egyptian written in Greek letters, and by 1945 it had been out of daily use for centuries. So Muhammad Ali bundled the books into his tunic, walked them home, and put them on the floor of the house, next to the oven. The oven is the part that hurts. His mother needed fuel. Straw burns fast, papyrus burns well, and there was a heap of loose old paper on her floor that nobody in the house could understand. Some of it went into the fire. We don't know exactly how much. One of the 13 books survives as a small handful of scraps and nothing else, and whether the oven is the reason is a guess, not a fact. I'd like to be able to tell you the family understood what they had. They didn't, and there's no version of this story where they should have. 13 books on a dirt floor, next to a bread oven. That is bad enough. What kept them out of the hands of anybody who could read them? for the best part of a year, is worse, and it has nothing to do with the fire. If you want the rest of what came out of that ground, and the men who carried it north to Cairo, make sure to subscribe to the Heretic Codex. The reason nobody in that village could take them to the government starts 6 months before the dig, with a man working a night shift. Muhammad Ali's father had been working nights as a watchman, guarding irrigation machinery. He shot an intruder. The next day, men from a village across the fields shot him. That's how a blood feud starts. In that part of Upper Egypt in the 1940s, a feud ran on its own schedule, and the state was not invited to it. Not long after the jar came out of the ground, the sons took their revenge. They found the man they held responsible and killed him in the road. What they did to the body afterwards is in Robinson's account, and I'm going to leave it there. That put the family in a very specific position. There's a jar's worth of unreadable ancient books in the house. There's a killing on the family's name, and the one institution you'd normally take them to is the government. So the most important manuscript discovery of the last 100 years spent the following months being shuffled around a village by people whose main concern was staying out of a police station. Muhammad Ali handed most of the books to a Coptic priest for safekeeping, a man named Basilius Abd al-Masih. One went to a neighbor, some were traded for cigarettes and fruit. That isn't a legend. That's the going rate when nobody knows what an object is. Muhammad Ali was still in that same village 30 years later, when a scholar from California came looking for him. We'll get back to that. And that, honestly, is the miracle here. Not that the books were buried, that they came out of a house with a blood feud running through it, and almost all of them intact. So, how does a thing like that finally reach a museum? Enter a history teacher named Raghib Andrawus. He was related to the priest by marriage, and on a visit, he saw a stack of very old books on his relative's shelf. A teacher was the first person in this chain with enough schooling to guess what they might be. Raghib took one to Cairo. He showed it to a Coptic physician, George Sobey, who called the Department of Antiquities the same day. By the autumn of 1946, that book had been bought by the Egyptian state and put into the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo. Its director, Togo Mina, started asking where the rest of it was. The rest had gone sideways. The books had been split up among the men who were at the cliff. A one-eyed outlaw from the village, a man called Bahij Ali, went round buying those shares back off them, one at a time, until he was holding most of the library himself. He took it to Cairo and sold it into the antiquities trade, where it landed with a Cypriot dealer named Phocion Tano. Tano was holding it for a collector. Neither of them kept it. Once the museum knew a whole library was loose in Cairo, the Department of Antiquities sequestered Tano's collection, and after the revolution of 1952, the state nationalized it outright. That is where all 13 are today, in cases in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, a short walk from the oldest churches in the city, and anybody with a ticket can stand in front of them. But one of them took 22 years longer to arrive than the rest. How does a 4th century Coptic book end up in a Swiss bank vault? That book is worth a detour, and I'll tell you why before I take it. The version of its story you'll meet everywhere is wrong, and what actually happened to it is the reason the rest of us couldn't read a word of this library for a generation. One of the 13 went the other way. It was bought out of that same Cairo trade by a Belgian antiquities dealer working in the city, a man named Albert Eid, who then got it out of the country. Eid died in 1950. His widow was left holding 4th century Coptic papyrus, with no legal way to sell it. In May of 1952, in Brussels, that codex was bought on behalf of an institute in Zurich. A young Dutch scholar named Gilles Quispel carried it across Europe. On the 15th of November 1953, it was formally handed over in Zurich, and it has been called the Jung Codex ever since. The institute was the C.G. Jung Institute, named for Carl Jung. Now, the story you'll read in a great many places is that the Codex was a 76th birthday present for Jung. I've looked at the dates, and they don't sit together. Jung's 76th birthday was in July of 1951, and that summer, the Codex was still sitting in a dead dealer's estate in Belgium. It was bought the following May and handed over in a Zurich hall, with an announcement 18 months after that. And Jung himself didn't want his name on it. A few weeks before the ceremony, he wrote to the Institute's director that he had never been comfortable with the idea of the Codex being baptized with his name. The most famous single object in this whole find carries the name of a man who asked, politely, for it not to. Why him at all? Because Jung had spent 30 years reading the Gnostics through their enemies, through the church fathers who wrote to refute them, and he'd built a good deal of his own thinking on what he found there. Handing him a genuine Gnostic codex was, from the Institute's side, an obvious move. Here's what the detour buys us, and it's the reason I took it. The sale came with a condition. Zurich would return the codex to Egypt after it had been published, and not before. So the pages went into a bank vault on the Bahnhofstrasse, and they stayed there while a small circle of scholars worked, at their own pace, on the only complete Gnostic library anyone had ever found. The last of those pages didn't reach the Coptic Museum until October of 1975. That pattern held across the whole find. Publication rights were parceled out, access was controlled, photographs were promised and not delivered. So when somebody tells you these books were suppressed, ask them which century they mean. In the 4th, somebody put them in a jar, and we'll get to who. In the 20th, the thing standing between you and these texts wasn't a bishop. It was an academic monopoly, and it was broken in the end by James Robinson, who organized a photographic edition so that anybody could read the pages without asking permission from anybody. The mattock hit that jar in 1945. The first complete English translation of everything inside it came out in 1977. That is 32 years, dirt to bookshop. So what was actually in it? Start with the objects, because everybody skips them. 13 books. Papyrus pages, folded and stitched into gatherings, sewn into soft leather covers with a flap and a thong to tie them shut. Held in the hand, they look like something you'd recognize as a book. In the ancient world, the default way to keep a text was a scroll. The bound book was the new format, and early Christians took to it hard. These leather covers are among the oldest surviving book bindings anywhere. Whatever you think of the contents, these objects sit near the beginning of the history of the book itself. And here's a question nobody asks about a book with no date in it. How do you date it at all? To give a leather cover some stiffness, you glue scrap paper inside it. The scrap paper used here was 4th century Egyptian wastepaper, private letters, contracts, accounts, the paperwork of ordinary lives. Scholars soaked those covers apart and read the rubbish. In one of the books, the scraps carry dates: 341, 346, 348. So that cover was made after the year 348. It can't have been made earlier, because the paperwork glued inside it hadn't been written yet. That is the dating argument for that book, and it anchors the rest of them, and it rests on somebody's unpaid grain bill. Now, 13 books. I've been saying 13 all episode, and 13 is generous, and the reason why says something about how badly somebody wanted to keep these. 12 of them are books. The 13th is 8 loose leaves, pulled out of their own binding in antiquity, and tucked inside the front cover of the 6th book by somebody who wanted to keep them and had run out of options. Those 8 leaves carry a text called the Trimorphic Protanoia, so the honest count is 12 books and a pocket. Inside the 12 and a pocket, 52 texts, in Coptic, nearly all of them translated out of Greek. 6 are duplicates. Around 40 had never been read by anybody alive. One word before the list, because I've been leaning on it. Gnostic is a label modern scholars use with more confidence than the people it describes ever did. There was no Gnostic church, and no creed. The word comes from gnosis, the Greek for knowledge, and the thread running through these books is that what saves a person is finding out how things actually are. Here's what's in there. The Gospel of Thomas, 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, with no story attached. No birth, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just the sayings, one after another, some of them familiar and some of them completely alien. Here is one of the alien ones. Jesus said, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This is the only complete copy in existence, and it's the reason most people know the name Nag Hammadi at all. Was Thomas completely unknown before 1945? Not quite. It had already been read, in pieces, by people who had no idea what they were holding. In the 1890s, two Oxford men, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, were digging through an ancient rubbish mound at Oxyrhynchus. They pulled out Greek scraps with sayings of Jesus written on them. They published them, and nobody could say which book the sayings had come from. That stayed unresolved for half a century, until the Coptic Thomas came out of the jar and matched them. That matters. If Thomas carries sayings that reached Egypt without passing through Matthew, Mark, Luke or John, it is an independent line back towards whatever Jesus actually said. Next, the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John, the fullest surviving account of the Gnostic creation story. The jar holds it 3 times over. A fourth was already sitting in Berlin, picked up in a Cairo market half a century earlier, and never published. No other text in this collection was copied anything like that often. When a community copies one book 3 times over, it is telling you which book it could not lose. The Gospel of Truth. It isn't a gospel in the biographical sense at all. It's a beautifully made sermon, and it may have been written by Valentinus, the most formidable Gnostic teacher of the 2nd century. The Hypostasis of the Archons, and On the Origin of the World, both of them retell Genesis from the other side, where the serpent is a teacher and the god of the garden is a jailer. Those two are the reason anybody outside a seminary has ever heard the word archon. And then the collection does something nobody expects. The thunder, perfect mind. It isn't a gospel or a treatise or a myth. It's a poem, spoken in the first person by a female voice, deliberately contradicting itself line after line. For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. Do not be ignorant of me anywhere or any time. Be on your guard. Do not be ignorant of me. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained what that text is for. It quotes nothing, it argues nothing, and it doesn't fit the Gnostic systems sitting around it in the same book. There are 3 Hermetic texts in the jar: pagan, Greek-Egyptian, philosophical, not Christian in any sense. There is a set of Christian moral sayings called the Sentences of Sextus, so unremarkable that Orthodox writers quoted it approvingly for centuries, filed in the same collection as the most heretical material in the find. And then there's the Gospel of Philip, and the page with the hole in it that I flagged in the opening minute. Philip isn't a gospel either. It's a collection of teachings about ritual, marriage, and language, in no obvious order, but one passage in it has done more work in popular culture than the rest of the Nag Hammadi library put together. One piece of background first, because it decides how people hear this. Mary Magdalene carries a reputation the Bible never gave her. Church writers folded her together with an unnamed sinner who washes Jesus' feet, and the composite stuck for 1,000 years. So by 1945, the woman in this line already came with a story attached. This is how it is usually printed, and I want you to hear it the way people quote it first. And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. He loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" except that is not what the page says. Two of those words are not on the papyrus at all. There are two holes in it, and somebody has filled them in. The first hole eats the word after companion. Savior is a guess, a good one, but a guess. And the second hole lands on the exact spot where the argument would be settled. Mouth, cheek, forehead, feet. Any of them fits the gap. The papyrus is gone at precisely that point, and no amount of scholarship is going to bring it back. That gap is the seed of the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown's novel leans heavily on the Gospel of Philip, and a lot of people first heard the words Nag Hammadi from a thriller published in 2003. Two honest caveats where they belong. The word translated as companion is koinonos, and it stretches from business partner all the way to spouse. The text does not tell you where on that range it sits, and a kiss, in early Christian writing, is very often a greeting. Paul tells whole congregations to greet each other with a holy kiss. What Philip does show, clearly, is that some early Christians put Mary Magdalene above the male disciples and said so in writing. That is the opposite of the reputation she was handed later, and it is the part of this passage that survives the damage. It's also not a marriage certificate, and the hole in the page is not evidence of a cover-up. It is just a hole in a page. Papyrus is a plant. Now for the other half of the inventory, and this is the half the internet gets wrong. What wasn't in the jar? The Gospel of Judas wasn't in the jar. That's the one where Judas is Jesus's closest confidant, and the betrayal is an instruction. It came out of Egypt separately, decades later, in what is now called the Codex Chacos, after the Zurich dealer, who eventually took it on. It spent part of the 20th century in a safe deposit box, and part in a freezer. The cold wrecked it faster than the desert ever had. And it is a 2nd century Gnostic composition, not a memo from the week of the crucifixion. It tells you what one group of Christians needed Judas to have been. About the man himself, it tells you nothing. The Gospel of Mary wasn't in the jar either. That one is in the same Berlin Codex I mentioned earlier, the one bought off a dealer in 1896. And the phrase "the banned books of the Bible" doesn't survive contact with the shelf. Nothing here was voted out of a Bible. Most of these texts were written after the 4 Gospels were already circulating, by people making a competing claim, and the churches that ended up winning never had them in the first place. There was no council where the Gospel of Thomas lost a show of hands. What is true is that Thomas was never going to win. There is no crucifixion in it, and no resurrection, and those are the load-bearing walls of the faith that did. On this channel, a banned book gets a name attached to the banning. For most of this collection, the honest answer is that there's no such name. And now, finally, the item I promised you at the start, the one that shouldn't be there at all. In the 6th book, sitting between an apocalypse and a Hermetic dialogue, somebody copied out a passage from Plato's Republic. It's the part where Socrates describes the soul as a many-headed beast with a lion and a man inside it. 2 pages of Greek philosophy, in Coptic, in the middle of a Christian library. And the translation is a wreck. It's off in ways that aren't stylistic. Scholars have argued for decades about whether the person who produced it could follow the Greek at all, or was working from a summary of a summary, or was bending Plato on purpose. What nobody disputes is that whoever assembled this library valued the passage enough to include it, and could not, or would not, give it to us straight. To me, that's the most human object in the collection. Somebody was entirely out of their depth, and copied it anyway. So is the find a letdown? No, but it's worth being precise about why, because the sensational reading and the real one point in completely different directions. For 16 centuries, everything anybody knew about these Christians came from the men prosecuting them. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote 5 books explaining what the Gnostics believed, and he wrote them specifically to destroy the Gnostics. Try reconstructing a religion from the case for its abolition. Then a jar comes out of the ground below that cliff, and these people are finally allowed to speak in their own words, at length, in their own books, with their own hymns, their own arguments, and their own bad Plato. That's the find, not a hidden Bible, a defendant, allowed at last to take the stand. Which leaves the question this whole episode has been walking towards. Who put them in the ground? There are 3 serious answers, and I'm not going to pick one for you, because the people who work on this for a living haven't. The first answer is the monks. In 367, the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Athanasius, posted his yearly Easter letter to the churches of Egypt. Halfway down it, he set out which books counted as scripture. 27 titles, the exact same 27 in a New Testament today. And he wrote that the others, the ones he called apocryphal, were not to be kept. There was a large Pachomian monastery a few kilometres from Jabal al-Tarif, at Babouv. The monks there would have had that letter read out to them. The dates in the covers put these books in exactly that century. And the wastepaper glued inside those covers includes letters written by monks. James Robinson built the case that a monastery library got cleaned out, and that somebody who couldn't bring himself to burn condemned books put them somewhere they might survive instead. It's a good story, but the evidence for it is circumstantial. The second answer is a grave. In 2014, Nicola Denzi Lewis and Justine Ariel Blount argued that the hole hidden from the bishop picture is a modern assumption we've read backwards into the site. Jabal al-Tarif isn't just a cliff, it's a cemetery, riddled with tombs. Burying books with the dead was a normal thing to do in Roman Egypt. Sealed jars are exactly what you find in graves, and in some of the versions Muhammad Ali told, there was a body at the spot, and a bed of charcoal. One of his brothers later denied the body flatly. The third answer is the quietest one, and it needs no drama at all. Somebody owned these books. A reader, a collector, a comfortable Christian in Upper Egypt with an appetite for strange theology, who paid to have them copied and bound. Then he died. What happens to a dead man's library, when the people left behind can't read it and don't want it, is that it goes into the ground with him or near him, in a jar. Nobody in the 4th century would consider that a dramatic act at all. Monks, a grave, or a private collection nobody wanted. Sitting under all 3 is a harder problem. We may not know the discovery site well enough to choose between them, because the origin story itself is fragile. The story I told you at the start is softer than it sounds. In 2013, Mark Goodacre laid the accounts side by side. Robinson had interviewed Muhammad Ali in the 1970s, 30 years after the event, through translators, about a morning that also involved a killing. Across the retellings, the number of men at the cliff goes from 2 to 7 to 8. The identity of the man who actually struck the jar moves. Details get added, and the added details are always the vivid ones. None of that makes the discovery a fiction. The books are real, the jar was real, and the cliff is exactly where they said it was. Robinson drove Muhammad Ali back out to Jabal al-Tarif in the 1970s and had him stand there and point at the ground. But the scene, the boulder, the hesitation over the jinn, the papyrus catching the light, all of it rests on one family's memory of the worst year they ever had, written down very late. This is the point where I stop trusting the story. The honest position is to hold the pictures loosely and the objects tightly. So here is the open problem, and it is a real one. If this ever gets settled, it won't be a lost document that solves it. It will be the Wastepaper. Thousands of fragments of ordinary 4th century Egyptian paperwork came out of those covers. Names, villages, monasteries, debts, dates. They're published in photographs. They're written in documentary Greek and Coptic hands. Those are hard to read, and a great many have never been properly worked through by anybody. Somewhere in that pile, there may be a name that puts these books in a specific building in a specific year. The people who can read those hands number in the low hundreds worldwide. The material is just sitting there, waiting, and the cliff itself has never been fully excavated. So the last word on the strangest library in the world probably isn't going to come from a gospel. It will come from somebody's unpaid grain account, glued to the inside of a book cover in a museum case in old Cairo. So, back to where it started. A man with a mattock, hoping for gold, stood over a sealed jar and worked out whether the thing inside it was worth the risk. He was wrong about the gold and right about the risk. What he pulled out landed in a house already living through the worst year it would ever have. Between them, those books went through a priest, an outlaw, a Zurich bank vault, and a scholarly embargo, and ended up behind glass in the city they should have gone to in the first place. And some of that papyrus went into a cooking fire because it was the paper on the floor. Tell me in the comments which of the three theories you'd put your money on: the monks, the grave, or a dead man's library that nobody wanted. I lean towards the monks, mostly because of the letters glued into those covers, and I have changed my mind about it twice. And if you want the book that Jar held 3 copies of, the full story of the demiurge, the god the Gnostics called a counterfeit, is already on this channel. Make sure to subscribe to the Heretic Codex.